There is no shortage of great scientists and scholars from the Islamic world historically, and we've gotten to know a few of them over the last few years on this channel. And another one of them, who is often forgotten outside the Persian-speaking Islamic world, is Nasirian Ethics, a brilliant polymath of the 13th century who made significant contributions to astronomy and mathematics, authoritatively commented on the earlier works of Ibn Sina, and wrote one of the most widely used and influential works of ethics in the history of the Islamic world. But aside from his many philosophical achievements, which he kind of shared with others like him and around his time, it is perhaps his life story that is the most fascinating and interesting of all. He lived through some of the most dramatic and world-altering events in the history of the Middle East and just the world in general, and he interacted with some of the most interesting people and movements of that time, such as what become known as the so-called assassins today. His religious affiliation is contested among different groups, all of whom basically want to claim him as their own. So, in short, this is a guy who it is certainly worth knowing more about. Nasirian Ethics was born in the city of Tus, located in what is today northeastern Iran in the region known as Khorasan, and he was born in the year 1201. Luckily, one of the surviving writings of Al-Ṭūsī, the Sayeh wa Suluk, is an autobiography where he describes his early life, his teachers, and achievements, and this is an incredibly helpful source for us in order to reconstruct his life, as well as being one of the most interesting of his works in how it deals with Ismaili theology, but we'll get to that a bit later. In any case, Al-Ṭūsī tells us that he comes from a family that was entirely occupied with the, quote, exoteric aspects of religion. What this means is that he probably came from a family of legal scholars, dedicated to the study and practice of the Sharia. While there is some debate on exactly what their affiliation was, it seems most probable that he came from a family of 12 Shi'i Muslims, in other words, the largest branch of Shia Islam. But Ṭūsī also tells us that his father, in particular, was a quite open-minded guy who encouraged him to study a wide array of subjects, and this seems to have fit Ṭūsī's own curiosity for all kinds of sciences and subjects. He tells us, quote, "He used to encourage me to study all the branches of knowledge and to listen to the opinion of the followers of various sects and doctrines." Then it happened that one of the students of Afdal-ad-Din Kashi, may God have mercy on him, came to the region. His name was Kamaluddin Muhammad Hasib, who had acquired a first-rate knowledge in a variety of philosophical subjects, especially in the art of mathematics. He had previously been a friend and acquaintance of my father. My father suggested that I should learn from him and frequent his company, so I began to study mathematics with him. Thus, he began his studies of the various sciences, which he would dedicate the rest of his life to. Kamaluddin Muhammad Hasib seems to have been important for his intellectual development, as Ṭūsī would go on to make great contributions in mathematics in particular. After his father died when he was still quite young, Ṭūsī set out to travel the world in search of knowledge and to continue studying the sciences, including the philosophical works of earlier thinkers such as Ibn Sina. But something was still troubling him. He realized that, as good and useful reason, intellect, and the sciences were for different purposes, they could never actually give us certain knowledge, especially as it pertained to God and the divine. Some other means seemed necessary, but he wasn't sure what it was. This might have been influenced by some of his teachers who were indeed connected in different ways to the so-called Isma'ilis, including Kamaluddin Hasib, whom Ṭūsī tells us would, quote, deprecate the exotericist, but never really elaborated too much on what he meant due to Ṭūsī's young age. In his autobiography, which was written for his Ismaili patrons after he had seemingly become an Ismaili, so keep that in mind, he tells us that he came to the conclusion that there must be some divine human authority in this world that was the final arbiter for revelation and which would have the full knowledge of God, able to give that knowledge to others. And when he got his hands on a work called the Fusul al-Muqaddas, the Sacred Chapters, by Hassan al-Dhikri Salam, the 23rd hereditary Imam of the Nizari Ismailis, he felt that his questions were finally answered. He thus sought out, became associated with, and became a kind of student of an important Ismaili missionary, a da'i and leader of the time, Nasiruddin Muhtashim, the Ismaili governor of Kohistan. He would live with Nasiruddin in Kohistan, serve in his court basically, and wrote several important works there, often dedicated to his patron, such as the book of ethics called Akhlaq al-Muhtashimi, which had been started by Nasiruddin but was finished by Ṭūsī, as well as his own Akhlaq al-Nasiri, the Nasirian Ethics, which would become very significant. Nasiruddin al-Ṭūsī, at this point in his life, seems to have embraced Ismaili Shi'ism as his creed and affiliation. This is significant and interesting for several reasons and would impact his writings and ideas for the rest of his life. Isma'ilism is, of course, a branch of Shia Islam, the second largest form of Shi'ism today, in fact. And back during Ṭūsī's life, their prominence was even greater, so some might even argue that they were the largest branch of Shi'ism at that time. Shi'ism distinguishes itself from Sunni Islam in several ways, but central to their doctrine is the idea of the Imam. The Imam is a hereditary descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and Ali ibn Abi Talib. The Imam is both the spiritual and political successor of the Prophet, the inheritor of his knowledge, and the only human beings that can fully interpret the Quran and its esoteric hidden meanings in order to apply it to new times and circumstances. All aspects of religious life, from scriptural interpretation, law and practice, community affairs, they all revolve around the person of the Imam and his authority. There is no proper religion without the Imam that stands at its center. The succession of one Imam after the other is seen as a kind of divine appointment called nas, that is given by one Imam to his son that is to succeed him. The different branches of Shi'ism are distinct in that they hold different lines of Imams to be correct. Both the Twelver and Ismaili branches agree on the first 5 or 6 Imams, starting with Ali and continuing until Ja'far as-Sadiq. After this, they split based on which son of Ja'far is believed to be the rightful successor, and the rest of the lineages thus diverge further from there. The Twelvers recognize 12 Imams in total, with another 6 following Ja'far until Muhammad al-Mahdi, the last Imam who went into occultation or hiding and is thought to return at the end of time. The Ismailis instead follow another long list of Imams, starting with Ja'far's son Ismail. And in the case of the Nizari Ismailis, this line of Imams survives even to this day with the Aga Khan. The time in which Nasiruddin al-Ṭūsī lived was very eventful and significant for Ismaili history. Over the course of the centuries, the Ismailis had established the Fatimid Empire from Cairo, where the leaders functioned as Khalifa Imams, or Caliph Imams, both political leaders of an empire, but also the spiritual leaders of the Ismaili community. But as that empire started to lose power, there were further splits in the imamate, and the Fatimids were eventually dethroned and crumbled under Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, or Saladin. One group that had already split off from the Fatimid Imam lineage shortly before had built a kind of state of their own in modern Iran. This was the Nizari Ismailis, named so because they believed that Nizar was the rightful successor to Caliph Imam al-Mustansir and thus split off from the rest. Under the leadership of a figure called Hassan Sabah, the Nizaris had established themselves in several different mountain fortresses along the West Iranian landscape, and thereby gained significant political power. The most central of these fortresses, and thus the center of the movement, was the castle of Alamut, where the Imam lived for the most part, and which was famous for housing many scholars and having an incredibly impressive library. Now, you might be recognizing some of these features and names because this is indeed the origins and context of the so-called assassins. Assassins was a word that became used to refer to the Nizari Ismailis in Iran and the Middle East by outsiders, and they became famous, among other things, for sending out hired killers to infiltrate the inner circles of their enemies and, well, to assassinate them. This is in fact where we get the term assassin from, even though the killers themselves weren't called assassins, but this word assassins was rather used for the wider the Nizari community as a whole. Of course, this is also the basis for the popular video game series called Assassin's Creed, which features Alamut in some of the games, as well as other famous Nizari fortresses like Masyaf in Syria. This was the world that Nasirian Ṭūsī became a part of. By becoming an Ismaili, he was pledging allegiance to the Ismaili Imam at Alamut, as well as to the general theological and philosophical tenets of Isma'ilism as it stood at that time, and which would become so prominent and important for his own creative output. Indeed, the Sayeh wa Suluk, the autobiography that I'm basing a lot of this episode on, is also kind of creedal statement about the role of the Imam and Ismaili theology, and thus contains some really interesting and important passages for our understanding of Ismaili theology and Imamology at that time, especially the doctrine of Ta'lim that had been developed by Hassan Sabbah and was further contributed to by Ṭūsī. Ṭūsī's creedal letter, the Sayeh wa Suluk, and his service to the Ismaili cause eventually paid off, as he was allowed to accompany Nasr ad-Din Muhtashim to the major fortresses of Alamut sometime in the mid-1230s. Here, he would have had the honor of meeting the Imam as well as other major scholars around him. In fact, Ṭūsī would spend the next 20 years of his life in Alamut and other major fortresses in the region, taking part in the flourishing scientific environment and library that was available there. It is during this period that he wrote most of his works, as well as some of his most significant ones. He not only became a representative of the Ismailis as a missionary scholar, he even rose through the ranks of the Ismaili clergy, so to say, to eventually receive the title of chief missionary, Da'i al-Tuat, for the faith. Among other things, he contributed a lot to Ismaili theology, and the fact that so many of his writings survive is very important for our understanding of Ismaili theology as it stood at that time, as will become much clearer later on. Because indeed, Nasirian Ṭūsī seems to have been a very famous scientist and scholar at that time, even outside of his scholarly circle in Alamut and these sort of Ismaili castles. He would write all these works on philosophy and science and all kinds of topics, and those writings were clearly spread to other parts of the Islamic world, were read. Ṭūsī was very famous as a scholar, right? So this means that many of his works were spread around and were read and copied, which would become very important for the survival of some of these sources on Ismaili theology for reasons that will become very clear a bit later on. For a better overview of Ismaili theology in general, you should check out my dedicated episode on Ismaili Shi'ism on the channel. In short, they very much emphasize the esoteric aspect of religion and the Quran. There are esoteric depths of revelation that are to be extracted through ta'wil, esoteric interpretation, and of course overseen by the Imam. Their theology and philosophy is strongly influenced by Neoplatonism, basically adopting the basic emanatory scheme from that school and applying it to Islamic theology. Many aspects of the Quran, such as the anthropomorphic statements on God, concepts like heaven and hell, and the resurrection, for example, are interpreted esoterically rather than literally by the Ismailis. Indeed, a few decades before Ṭūsī, the Imam Hassan al-Dhikr salam had announced the Qiyamah, or resurrection, that the resurrection had indeed come. But as you might imagine, this wasn't the resurrection as we commonly understand it, but a change in human consciousness, especially for the Ismailis, and a new era for the world where many aspects of the Sharia weren't necessary anymore, such as, for example, the daily prayers or pilgrimage to Mecca. Right? So this was an esoteric interpretation of the very concept of the resurrection in the Quran and Islamic theology. So, esotericism and Neoplatonism. Very important. But we're not going to go too deeply into Ismaili theology, but focus on one area where Ṭūsī's writings are very significant for our understanding, the doctrine of Ta'lim. What this was essentially a more systematized and deepened understanding of the already apparent doctrine of the Imam in Shi'ism, that it is the Imam that has ultimate authority to interpret and teach correct religion, and that his followers submit fully to his rulings. The doctrine of ta'lim, as it was during the Alamut period, seems to have been developed by the famous Hassan Sabbah, but sadly none of his writings survive. Instead, we have to turn to things like the writings of Ṭūsī to get a proper picture of it. This we find expressed primarily in two works, the Sayr wa Suluk that we have already discussed, as well as another work that is somewhat contested in its authorship, and which is called the Rawd-e Taslim, the Paradise of Submission. This work, in fact, according to the surviving text itself, as well as experts that study its style, was probably not written by the hand of Ṭūsī himself, but the introduction seems to indicate that it was overseen and supervised by him, and that it thus also accurately represents the doctrines of the Nizari Ismailis at that particular time, and of which Ṭūsī was such a prominent figure and authority. As mentioned before, the doctrine of ta'lim was essentially just an elaboration on the general idea of the imamates in Shi'ism more generally, where the imam is the sole religious and spiritual authority who represents the prophetic lineage and correct interpretation of scriptures. What Hassan Sabbah did in works like the Fusul al-Arba'a, and which we find echoed in Ṭūsī's works, is an even stronger emphasis and further solidification of this idea of the imam. The scholar Farhad Daftary writes that the doctrine of ta'lim, presented by Hassan Sabbah, was both more rigorous and more self-sufficient than the traditional Shi'i view of the subject. In his argumentation, Hassan consistently emphasized the role of the Imam with the Prophet as a link in the logical chain from God to Imam. This doctrine, stressing the autonomous teaching authority of each Imam in his time, became the central doctrine of the early Nizari Ismailis, also serving as a powerful ideological tool in the hands of the Nizari community of later times. Meanwhile, in the absence of an accessible Imam, the community authority depended on his hujjah, proof, and Hassan himself, as noted, was recognized as that hujjah. The Imam played a central role in Ismaili metaphysics and cosmology. One can sometimes hear polemical claims from critical Sunni Muslims that say that the Ismailis see the Imam as God and worship him as such, but this isn't really the case. In the strongly Neoplatonism-influenced theology of the Ismailis, there is an emissary scheme from God, who is identified with the Platonic One, who originates the first intellect, who actually plays the role of God as we commonly understand God, according to the Ismailis, and then the universal soul, and then the physical world. This is the basic outline, but different Ismaili thinkers have had varying versions of this scheme. For example, the Fatimid missionary Hamiduddin al-Kirmani presents a scheme that is a lot more complex, with many different intellects and so on, just like other Islamic thinkers like Ibn Sina or al-Farabi. But in basic terms, this is a very Neoplatonic system. And one of the things that is unique about the Ismailis is that they often added a step in between the one God/originator and the first intellect, what was referred to as the kalam, the speech or sublime word of God, or sometimes also as the amr, the command of God. It is a subtle, non-temporal, quote-unquote, moment that separates the absolutely apophatic God from the first thing that it originates. Now, one could argue against the uniqueness of this doctrine of the Ismailis by pointing at the so-called pre-noetic efflux that Plotinus seems to talk about in the Enneads as some kind of step between the one and the nous, as well as certain more complicated later Neoplatonist writers, but I digress. And in Ismaili theology, especially in the Nizari branch that we are talking about now, the Imam is often identified with this command of God, this kalam of God. He is the earthly manifestation of the command, but not of God himself. Now, it should be noted that some Ismailis disagreed with this, including the aforementioned Kirmani, who saw in it a danger of coming too close to divinizing the Imam. But Kirmani would go on to become more influential on the Taibi branch of Ismailis than the Nizaris. Instead, the Alamut era Ismailis like Hassan Sabbah and Ṭūsī seems to adopt this idea quite fully. Quote, "The sublime word, kalima ya'ala, the first intellect, aql al-awwal, and the universal soul, nafs al-kulli, each have a manifestation in this world. The manifestation of the sublime word is the Imam, may salutations ensue upon mentioning him, whose reality is beyond all human thought and imagination, and above all description, whether it be positive or negative. The manifestation of the first intellect is the supreme hujjat, proof of the Imam who gives perfection its form. On this metaphysical basis, the Imam stands as the authority in the world. As Hassan Sabah and others argued, human reason is really insufficient to reach truths or to know anything about God. We must instead turn to trust in an authority who knows those truths himself and in a direct way. And unlike in Sunnism, where that authority is given to the multitude of the scholarly community, the ulama or the Sufi sheikhs, here it is the one Ismaili Imam that is that authority. An authority that he doesn't have to prove by external factors, but which is indicated by his very existence. In the Sayr wa Suluk, after a long section outlining the more metaphysical and cosmological arguments for the existence of the Imam, which is too long and involved to go through here, but which you should definitely check out if you're interested, Ṭūsī gives us a statement on what it means to truly submit to this doctrine of ta'lim and the authority of the Imam as the one path to know God in the world. He says, "Now that I've come to know that unique person who is the Imam of the epoch, the Imam of the age, the teacher of the followers of ta'lim, the locus of the word, mazhar kalima, he who enables one to recognize God, praise be to him. And now that I've surrendered to the fact that he is the real instructor, the truthful one, the ruler, and I've attained the status of submission, utterly abandoned my own will, and arrived at the realm of learning and subjection, I realize that my recognition and knowledge are to be that which my teacher says are true recognition and knowledge. And everything else is pure unknowing and ignorance. Proof and demonstration are to be what he says are correct proof and demonstration, and everything else is doubt and error. Religion and obedience are to be that which he says are true religion and obedience, and everything else is irreligion, unbelief, and innovation. Whatever comes from him is the straight path, pure faith and guidance, and whatever comes from myself, my personal opinion, desire, speculation, intellect, knowledge, and insight, and which is contrary to his teaching, is deviation. The Imam has the authority to interpret and reinterpret religion for whatever time he is in, because he has the full knowledge of the meaning and purpose of revelation and of God. As Daftary said in a previous quote, the autonomous teaching authority of each Imam in his time. This is why, for example, the aforementioned Hassan al-Dhikr salam, also known as Hassan II, could proclaim that the esoteric qiyamah or resurrection had taken place, and thus that the Nizaris didn't have to follow certain important aspects of the Muhammadan Sharia anymore, and that only 2 Imams later, under Jalaluddin Hassan, Hassan III, that proclamation of the qiyamah could be reversed, and the Nizaris went back to practicing the outer forms of Islam again. Nizaris themselves will argue that this was because of taqiyya, that the Imam thought it best to outwardly practice the law to not garner too much negative attention from other Muslims and face persecution. But the point is that the Imam could make these drastic decisions, even ones that seemingly contradict the decisions of earlier Imams, because they could know and recognize what the appropriate employment of revelation and law was during different historical circumstances. And this is the doctrine of ta'lim that Ṭūsī represented and wrote about, at least for a major portion of his career. Being an Islamic philosopher, Ṭūsī of course stands in a long line of previous such scholars whom he is indebted to. In particular, Ṭūsī is strongly influenced by the great Persian Muslim philosopher Ibn Sina, known in Latinized form as Avicenna, one of the greatest minds in the history of the world. Ṭūsī, in fact, wrote a commentary on Ibn Sina's most mature philosophical work, the Isharat wal-Tanbihat, pointers and reminders, that have become one of the most popular and famous in the world. It stands alongside Fakhruddin al-Razi's commentary as the 2 most used and popular commentaries on the Isharat, Ṭūsī's being more positive and supportive, while al-Razi's being more critical. In fact, Ṭūsī's commentary on this work really revived Ibn Sina's popularity at that time, and most later readers and interpreters of the Isharat would read it through the eyes and perspectives of this commentary. William Chittick says, as a result of the study of Ibn Sina, especially as seen through Ṭūsī's eyes in his commentary on Avicenna's Al-Isharat wal-Tanbihat, became a mainstay of intellectual life wherever philosophy was cultivated in the Islamic world. Ibn Sina, then, may be viewed as a symbol for the pole of the intellect in Islamic civilization, while Nasirian Ethics is his most influential follower. And Ṭūsī also, of course, developed his own ideas and writings, specializing primarily in things like logic, mathematics, and astronomy. So Ṭūsī was very famous at this point in Nizari Ismaili circles as an important theologian and expositor of Ismaili doctrine. But also he was famous outside of the Ismaili circles, as we said, as a great scholar, scientist, and philosopher for the wider Islamic world as well. But another surprising field, perhaps, where he would become very prominent and important is in the field of ethics. Indeed, before he moved to Alamut and was still living in Khohistan, he wrote a work of ethics called the Akhlaq-e Nasiri, the Nasirian Ethics. This is a quite long and comprehensive exposition of what Ṭūsī calls the science of practical philosophy. He says in the introduction to the work that practical philosophy too has three divisions. The first is called ethics, the second economics, and the third politics. The work is subsequently divided into three parts, each dealing with one of these branches. The ethics section is by far the longest, where he deals with everything from the cultivation of the soul and its good character, the sickness of the soul and how to treat it, and many such topics. The economics part is pretty self-explanatory, and the politics talks about just society and leadership, but also a profound section on love as the connector of societies. I want to quote one part of this section about love and how it connects to politics and society, where Ṭūsī says, "Men need each other then, and the perfection and completion of each one lies with the other individuals of the species. Moreover, necessity demands a request for aid, for no individual can reach perfection in isolation, as has been explained. This being so, there is an inescapable need for a synthesis, which will render all individuals cooperating together comparable to the organs of one individual. Again, since man has been created with a natural direction towards perfection, he has a natural yearning for the synthesis in question. This yearning for the synthesis is called love. All individuals in society are like parts of a single body, and we want all of them to be healthy in order for the entire body itself to be healthy. This also recalls a famous poem by Omar Khayyam, who talks in a very similar way. And this natural striving for this synthesis or harmony between different people and parts of this body of society, so to say, is what Ṭūsī calls love. Through his discussions of what could be conceived as mundane topics, he's able to explore a vast array of different philosophical subjects, from psychology and metaphysics to biology and natural sciences. He quotes from ancient philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and his politics section also builds on the work of the earlier Islamic philosopher Al-Farabi and his political treatise. This work, the Nasirian Ethics, would become perhaps the most authoritative and important work on ethics for basically the rest of Islamic history, at least in the wider so-called Persianate cultural sphere, or again what Shahab Ahmed calls in his book What is Islam, the Balkans to Bengal complex. This is a wide cultural sphere that was unified, among other things, by the prominence of the Persian language as sort of an administrative and just cultural language, right? And within this wider sphere, which included the great Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Qajar Empire, as well as the Mughal Empire. It's a vast area, right? Especially here, the Nasirian Ethics was like, it's the work of ethics for the rest of the late medieval and early modern period. So Nasiruddin Ṭūsī is very important, especially for this wider intellectual and cultural sphere. But the scholarly, comfortable environment in which Ṭūsī flourished was not to last. After about 20 years, things were about to take a dramatic turn. We can find across his writings certain indications about a looming threat on the horizon. Something very frightening and dramatic was happening in the world, and it was quickly approaching the region of Alamut and the central Islamic lands. This was, of course, the Mongol invasions, which would change the geographical and cultural landscape of the world permanently. In 1256, Hulagu and his armies reached Alamut. Destroying the Ismaili state and their fortresses seems to have been a top priority for him. Now, what exactly happened here is somewhat murky. It seems that Ṭūsī might have been among those in the castle that favored peacefully giving up to the Mongols, Some even claim that he might have betrayed his masters altogether. Whatever the case, after centuries of being basically impenetrable to attack and withstanding many previous attempts, the fortress of Alamut fell to the Mongols, who subsequently torched the whole place, burned down the library except for a few select books, and basically killed everyone. Ṭūsī, however, was allowed to live. Some say it's because Hulagu himself had an interest in astrology, and Ṭūsī was, through his knowledge of those topics, able to negotiate himself into a position in his court, which is exactly what happened. Ṭūsī would accompany Hulagu and the Mongols as they continued on their campaign of conquest, probably being an eyewitness to the sacking of Baghdad and the execution of the last Abbasid caliph only 2 years later. The great philosopher himself also went through some significant changes, at least publicly. It appears that after Alamut fell to the Mongols, Ṭūsī renounced the Ismaili faith and instead became a Twelver Shi'i, rejoining the creed of his family and his upbringing. But what's actually going on here? This is in fact one of the major controversies about Nasirian Ṭūsī and his life, and both Twelver Shi'is and Ismailis claim Ṭūsī as belonging to their camp, so to say, and they have different interpretations and understandings of his life based on those ideas and those opinions, right? So the Twelver Shi'is, for example, they will point to the fact that he was a Twelver, he came from a Twelver family, and that when he studied and spent time with the Ismailis, that was basically, they will argue that that was basically, he was being kept a prisoner, right? And so he was forced to pretend to be an Ismaili to further, to survive, first of all, right? To not be killed or persecuted, a sort of form of taqiyya, I guess, but also maybe to gain access to certain scholarly circles and writings, right, to further the actual cause of Twelverism. And that when the Mongols then invaded, and he clearly saw that the time for the Ismaili Imam at Alamut was coming to an end, that he then could return to his actual belief in Twelver Shi'ism. Right? This will even be an argument for why it is sometimes claimed that Ṭūsī might have helped Hulagu and the Mongols to conquer Alamut, right? Because from this point of view, he wasn't actually loyal to the Ismailis at all. This was just a facade. So this was his opportunity to leave that behind and return to openly profess his true faith in Twelver Shi'ism. So that's like their view of it. The Ismailis will view it basically the other way around, that his conversion to Ismailism was genuine, that he firmly believed in the Ismaili creed and followed the Imam, and that when the Mongols invaded and conquered Alamut and all this happened, the Ismaili castle state was destroyed. That at that point, Ṭūsī sort of faked that he converted back to Twelverism, because of course the Mongols had very much seen the Ismailis as their opposition, and so to be associated with Ismailism for Ṭūsī would have been detrimental to his relationship with the Mongols if he wanted to survive and to serve them, which he did, right? So they will argue that instead of him performing taqiyya when he was an Ismaili, the taqiyya is in this later phase when he claims to be a Twelver, whereas really he was always an Ismaili. So right, these are two opposite views of his true identity, his true religious affiliation, and they will, both of these groups will very strongly argue for their case and their perspective. Reading his own writings, such as the Sayeh wa Suluk, it's hard not to read it as a very genuine conviction in the truth professed by the Ismailis. But on the other hand, he later in his life wrote the Tajrid al-I'tiqad, which would become a central theological work in Twelver Shi'ism. Right? So there are good arguments for both sides. Right? I'm not sure where I stand necessarily, but I do feel like based on his writings, his Ismaili conviction certainly seems very genuine, especially in places like the Sayeh wa Suluk. But it is an open kind of question, I would say. Others instead see in Ṭūsī just a person who changes his coat. He's a turncoat, basically. He just chooses the creed or the faith that is most politically or socially beneficial to him at any given moment, that he became an Ismaili basically just on the surface in order to access the scholarly milieu in Alamut and the library there and the scholars in order to further his education, his scholarship, his philosophy. And that when the Mongols invaded and that culture was destroyed, that he then chose Twelverism because that was most beneficial to him in his political career at that point, because he wouldn't want to associate with the Ismailis, who had just been destroyed by the Mongols and who had fought them, but he wouldn't either want to necessarily associate with the Sunnis, which was represented by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, who the Mongols were now also sort of moving towards and would eventually, of course, conquer and destroy. Right? So Twelverism would have been a good kind of neutral middle point that was the least offensive and beneficial to him at that point in his life, right? So this is another perspective on his life, that he simply did whatever was most beneficial to him. But his life was by no means over. He would live for another 20 years and make some of his most major contributions after being employed by the Mongols. This is particularly the case for his work on astronomy. Indeed, Hulagu seems to have been very happy with Ṭūsī. So happy, in fact, that he sponsored a project to build for Ṭūsī an observatory in the city of Maragha. Ṭūsī convinced the Khan to build this major and large observatory to be able to make more accurate observations about the movements of the planets and the stars, and that was definitely the case. The observatory in Maragha and the work being done there was the most major and important astronomical center in the world at that time, and Ṭūsī himself oversaw its activities and wrote about his many findings and theories regarding the updated and superior calculations about the movements of the planets. These important works of astronomy that he composed includes the Ilkhanic tables and the massive Tadkira fi Ilm al-Haya, a kind of memoir on astronomy. One of the most important of his observations and theories in this field was something that would become known as the Ṭūsī couple, which is obviously named after him. I'm not going to pretend to be an astronomer or to be able to properly explain this, so I'm going to sink to the level of quoting directly from Wikipedia, which explains it like this, quote, "The Ṭūsī couple, also known as Ṭūsī's mechanism, is a mathematical device in which a small circle rotates inside a larger circle twice the diameter of the smaller circle. Rotations of the circles cause a point on the circumference of the smaller circle to oscillate back and forth in linear motion along a diameter of the larger circle." Why am I quoting Wikipedia, you may ask? Well, I thought of all the sources I could find, this seemed to explain it in the most pedagogical and simple way, so, sorry. This Ṭūsī couple, in fact, became very important in order to better understand and to be able to calculate the movements of the planets in their revolving motions in the solar system. Ṭūsī's ideas, in fact, especially this Ṭūsī couple, most likely had a direct influence on later European astronomers and scientists, especially Copernicus, who would go on, partly thanks to the work of people like Ṭūsī, to propose the heliocentric model of the solar system. While it is unsure just how these ideas came to him, whether he was directly familiar with Ṭūsī's writings or those of his circle, or if this influence was more indirect through general influence and spread of ideas over the centuries, most agree that this influence is a fact regardless. And this becomes especially clear in how Copernicus seems to directly adopt the Ṭūsī couple. Coincidence, you might say? Well, that position becomes quite hard to hold when you look at the two side by side and realize that he even copied these specific letters that were used in the illustration of Ṭūsī. The original Aleph on top becomes an A, the Ba at the bottom becomes a B, etc. In other words, modern astronomy wouldn't be what it is without Nasirian Ṭūsī, and it is quite legitimate to consider him the most significant astronomer between Ptolemy and Copernicus himself. In a related sense, he also made significant contributions to mathematics. Of course, most of what I've just said, these astronomical teachings or ideas, would fall under the wider category of mathematics, but he did make contributions to the sort of specific field of mathematics in the sense that he is considered to have basically invented the subfield of trigonometry. Of course, the method of trigonometry was used earlier in astronomical calculations, but in places like his treatise on the quadrilateral, he properly establishes the discipline of trigonometry as its own branch of mathematics. So you can kind of blame him for some of those headaches in school. Clearly, Nasiruddin At-Tusi was an intellectual genius, making major contributions to the rational sciences like astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, and biology. And he should rightly be considered one of the great scientists in the history of mankind. But just like with Ibn Sina, there is also an intriguing connection and question regarding his relationship to so-called mysticism. At this time, Sufism, or Islamic mysticism, was an omnipresent aspect of Islam around the Islamic world, and mystics often had as much, if not more, authority than scholars and philosophers. But was Tusi a mystic at all? Based on what we have said so far, there is very little to suggest so, but it is a little more complicated. We know that Tusi was familiar with and in contact with quote-unquote Sufis. For example, he corresponded with the great Akbari mystic Sadruddin al-Qūnawī in Konya, who was the stepson and primary student of the great Ibn Arabi. In these correspondences, Tusi certainly comes off as the other compared to Qūnawī's mysticism, a representative of rationalism that Qūnawī opposes. This correspondence between them is quite cordial and friendly in tone. Al-Qūnawī recognizes At-Tusi as the foremost philosopher of his age and states that he wanted to start this correspondence in order to form a friendship, as well as that, quote, "I had hoped to combine the conclusions derived from logical proofs and the fruits of unveiling and direct vision." This correspondence, which is mainly through a set of questions sent by Al-Qūnawī that Tusi then responds to, and then a last response to those answers by Al-Qūnawī, this correspondence can tell us a lot about these different schools and approaches to Islam. The Sufis, or mystics, whom Qūnawī represents, essentially view the intellect, the aql, as completely unable to grasp or give us any certain knowledge about divine things. For that, we instead have to turn to mystical unveiling, kashf, dhawq, or tasting, and direct vision, as he says in his letter. Reason and the intellect only obscures and confuses those who try to understand God through it. The philosophers, whom Tusi represents for the most part, instead claim that the aql, or reason, indeed is the best way for us to reach certain knowledge about things. Because if we only base ourselves on the personal unveiling and vision of individual mystics, how can we know for sure that those are true, or that the unveilings of different mystics even correspond to each other? Instead, we must employ reason and demonstrate proofs to reach certain knowledge. Qūnawī and At-Tusi were very qualified to have this discussion, because none of them represent the extreme ends of either position, allowing them to kind of meet in the middle in some respect. Qūnawī is famous for taking the visionary ideas of his master Ibn Arabi and presenting them in a very systematic, philosophical way that clearly showcased that he had great mastery over these methods and sciences, which also does become clear from his questions here. Tusi, similarly, while certainly a philosopher, did have his doubts about the full usefulness of reason, as we saw before, although he came to the conclusion that the solution lay in a single divine guide in the world because he was an Ismaili. It also becomes clear from his responses to Qūnawī that Tusi is deeply read and has extensive knowledge about Sufism and is able to respond in kind. While they end up disagreeing on many fundamental points, there is room here for harmonization in certain regards, and as I said, the tone of the letters is very friendly. Qūnawī even himself states that while they disagree on their epistemology, his group of mystics, whom he calls the verifiers, the muhaqqiqun, are closer to the philosophers than to the kalam theologians, for example. He says, "The verifiers agree with the philosophers concerning those things which the theoretical intellect is able to grasp independently at its own level. Then they differ from them in other perceptions and knowledge beyond the stage of thought and its delimiting properties. But as for the theologians in their various schools, the verifiers only agree with them in rare instances and on minor points." But there is more to Tusi than meets the eye. On the one hand, Isma'ilism itself, while of course strongly emphasizing reason and intellect, also has a quite strong mystical side. There's an inherent mysticism in the doctrine of the Imam, and the esoteric interpretations and practices are certainly sometimes mystical in character. In fact, in the Sayr wa Suluk, there's a section where the role of the Imam is expressed in quite mystical ways, and where the doctrines of the Ismailis, whom he calls the people of unity, are presented as almost monistic in character. Quote, "In the eyes of the people of unity, there is neither this nor that, neither truth nor falsity, neither multiplicity nor oneness, neither resurrection nor religious law, neither outward nor inward, neither origin nor return. Everything is He, and apart from Him there exists nothing, nothing in nothing. Suffice it not that thy Lord is witness over all things. And furthermore, there is actually another work in which Ṭūsī tackles the question of mysticism and mystical experiences like union and fana more head-on. This is a work called the Awsaf al-Ashraf, the Attributes of the Noble. The attribution of this work to Ṭūsī isn't agreed upon by everyone, partly because it seems to differ so much from his approach in other works, but that in itself isn't really reason enough to reject it as authentic. In the preface to the book, Ṭūsī claims that it's a kind of companion to his earlier work of ethics, the Akhlaq al-Nasiri that we talked about, and clearly states what his intention with the book is. Quote, "The author of this discourse, Muhammad Ṭūsī, had it in his mind to write a concise treatise describing the ways of the awliya and the methods of the seers according to the principles of the wayfarers of the path and the seekers of the truth, and one based on the principles of reason and tradition, containing the subtle theoretical and practical points that constitute the kernel and essence of that discipline." What follows is a discourse in 6 parts, each containing 6 subparts that discuss different requirements on the mystical or spiritual path, such as faith and sincerity, asceticism and seclusion, patience and thankfulness, contemplation of oneself and the external world, and many other features. And once one reaches the higher stations of the path, such things like love and complete submission to the reality of God, the seeker can experience union, ittihad, with God, the oneness of all being, and the annihilation, fana, of the self or ego. Here, it becomes clear that Ṭūsī has a quite sophisticated and proper understanding of the intricacies of the Sufi doctrine on union and annihilation. Quote, "Ittihad is not what some short-sighted people imagine, that it is the becoming one of the creature with God, the exalted. Greatly exalted is He above that. Rather, it means seeing all as Him, without being constrained to say that everything other than Him is from Him and so all are one. Rather, this vision is so illumined with the light of His manifestation, exalted is His station, that it does not see other than Him, there remaining no seer, seen, or sight, and all become one. At this stage, it is known that the one who declared, 'I am the truth,' and the one who said, 'Glory be to me, how great is my majesty,' did not claim divinity, but negated his egohood and affirmed the absurdity of someone other than himself, and this is the desired goal." Speaking of the highest stage of fana, or complete annihilation of the self, Ṭūsī says, "In wahda, oneness, there is no wayfarer or wayfaring, way and destination, search, seeker, and the sought, and everything perishes except His face. This matter has neither an affirmation and its explanation, nor a negation and its explanation. For affirmation and negation are opposites, and duality is the source of multiplicity. Here, there is neither negation nor affirmation, neither negation of negation, nor affirmation of affirmation, neither negation of affirmation, nor affirmation of negation. And this is called fana, annihilation. For the return of creation is by fana, even as its origins was from Adam, non-existence." This is clearly not some critical philosopher or theologian that presents a bad strawman picture of Sufi doctrines, but clearly someone who knows what he is talking about. It's fascinating to read these accounts in the Awsaf al-Ashraf, where Ṭūsī maps out the levels and experiences of the mystical path. And he isn't doing it from a critical point of view, but in a sort of matter-of-fact way of describing, in his own words, the way of the awliya, or the friends and saints of God. Based on this, mysticism/Sufism and its teachings were certainly real to him. It was a taken-for-granted aspect of the wider Islamic culture and religion. But whether or not Ṭūsī himself was a mystic or had any personal experience of these states that he describes is hard to say. Basically, there's a lot to this guy, as you can probably tell. He was a polymath in every sense of that word, straddling the lines of Ismaili theology, Islamic philosophy generally, rational sciences like astronomy and mathematics, and maybe even mysticism to some degree. For the last years of his life, he remained an important person in the court of the Mongol Khan as a scientific advisor, and continued to make important contributions to science and philosophy in places like the observatory in Maraga. He died in Baghdad in the year 1274, probably from natural causes, but his legacy would become massive. In the Islamic world, his commentaries on Ibn Sina became paradigmatic. His work on ethics is some of the most influential in the history of the Islamic world, especially in the eastern parts of the Islamic lands. His achievements in science, especially astronomy and mathematics, helped us further our understanding of the universe that we live in, and also provided inspiration and guidance to astronomers and scientists in Europe centuries later who would have significant impacts on the world that we live in today. Al-Ṭūsī is recognized not only in the Islamic world, but globally. A crater on the moon is named Nasiruddin after him to honor his contributions to scientific progress. And as we said in the beginning, his life story and biography is incredibly interesting and can tell us so much about the political and religious landscape of the Islamic world at that time, including him being an eyewitness to and maybe even kind of a participant in the cataclysmic Mongol invasions. So for all these reasons, among many others, it's worth knowing about Nasiruddin Al-Ṭūsī. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I would like, as always, to extend a special thank you to my patrons who support this channel monetarily and without whom none of this would be possible. I am deeply grateful and humbled by all of your wonderful support. If anyone else wants to become a patron, and that would be very, very helpful for me to continue making this free educational content here on YouTube and elsewhere, I will leave links to that in the description so you can check that out. You can follow my link tree in the description as well for general ways to keep up with my work and my socials. You can also leave a one-time donation through PayPal or through Patreon to support me, or simply like the video, subscribe, and comment and keep the discussion going there. You can follow me on my socials, on Instagram, on TikTok, and all these places. You can also check out my other channel, Filip Holm, which is dedicated to my music, both me playing my music and publishing my music, but also talking about music in a similar kind of way that I talk about religion here. I talk about sort of music history and that kind of thing over on that channel. So check that out. There is a link tree in the description where you can find all my links to all the kind of wonderful and juicy stuff that I'm up to if you want to keep up with me. So thank you again so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time.